Welcome to Bedtime Whispers, where darkness comes to life and nightmares become reality. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people without sleep for 15 days using an experimental stimulant gas. These people were kept in a locked cell to monitor the oxygen balance in the cell, since the gas was toxic in large doses. There were no video cameras for surveillance at the time, so all the experimenters could afford were microphones inside the room with the test subjects and holes in the walls covered with thick 5-inch glass. The cell had books, beds for sleeping without bedding, running water, a toilet, and enough dry food to live on for a month. The test subjects were political prisoners during World War I. For the first 5 days, everything was fine. The subjects hardly complained as they were promised, by lying, that they would be released at the end of the experiment if they did not sleep for a month. All of their conversations and actions were monitored. It was noted that as time passed, their conversations became more and more dominated by gloomy topics related to unpleasant memories. After 5 days, they began to complain about the events leading up to their current condition and began to show severe paranoia. Having stopped communicating with each other, they began whispering reports on their cellmates into microphones. Rather strangely, they thought they could gain the trust of the experimenters by giving away their friends. At first, the scientists thought it was the effect of the gas itself. On the 10th day, one of them began to scream. He ran all over the cell screaming from time to time for 3 hours and tried to scream further, but apparently damaged his vocal cords. The most amazing thing was that the others did not react to this in any way. They kept whispering into the microphones until the second of them followed the first and started screaming. The others tore out the sheets of their books and, wetting them with saliva, covered the windows of the cell. For a time, the shouting and whispering into the microphones ceased. For the next 3 days, not a sound came out of the cells. The researchers did not stop monitoring oxygen consumption, and it was high, as if all 5 of them were exercising. On the morning of day 14, the researchers decided to take a step they had not intended to take to get a reaction from the subjects. They addressed them through the speakers in the cell because they feared they were either dead or in a coma. The researchers reported, "We are opening the cell to check the microphones. Step away from the door and lie on the floor or you will be shot. Cooperation will result in the release of one of you." To their surprise, the only response was, "We don't need freedom anymore." A meeting was convened among the scientists and the military who funded the study. Since there was no response from the subjects, it was decided to open the chamber on the 15th day. All the stimulant gas was taken out of the cell and filled with fresh air. Immediately after that, 3 voices from the cell began begging for the return of the gas as if their lives depended on it. The cell was opened and soldiers were sent in to take the test subjects out. They began screaming louder than before, and soon the cries were joined by the soldiers who saw what was going on inside. 4 of the 5 victims of the experiment were alive, but their condition could hardly be called life. The food supplies from day 5 were untouched. Pieces of meat from the chest and legs of the body of the 5th had plugged the drainage holes in the chamber, so that the chamber was flooded by 4 inches, and it was difficult to tell how much of it was occupied by blood. All 4 survivors were also missing a significant amount of muscle and skin torn from their bodies. Judging by the injuries and exposed bones on their fingers, we could tell that they had done it with their hands, not their teeth, as originally thought. Further examination indicated that most, if not all, had damaged themselves. The internal organs below the thorax of all 4 had been ripped out, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscle on the ribs had been torn away so that the lungs were visible. All of the removed organs and vessels were intact and simply lay on the floor around the bodies of the still living subjects. Their digestive tract was still working, digesting food. It became clear that they had been eating themselves all along. Most of the soldiers were Russian special forces, but nevertheless, many refused to return to the cell to take the tasked subjects out, while the latter kept screaming and begging for guests to keep them awake. To everyone's surprise, the tasked subjects put up a fierce resistance when they tried to be carried out of the cell. One soldier died because his throat had been chewed. Another was mortally wounded because his balls had been bitten off and an artery in his leg had been severely damaged. The other 5 soldiers committed suicide a few weeks later. In the fight, one of the 4 test subjects injured his spleen and died almost immediately from blood loss. The medics tried to sedate him, but it turned out to be impossible. They gave him a 10-fold dose of morphine, but he was still fighting like a hunted animal, breaking one of the doctor's ribs and arm. His heart was beating for 2 minutes after he became so exsanguinated that there was more air than blood in his vessels. Even after his heart stopped, he was still screaming for 3 minutes, trying to hit everyone who came up and just saying more over and over again, weaker and weaker, until finally he was silent. The remaining 3 were firmly tied up and moved under medical supervision, while 2 of them, who had not yet damaged their vocal cords, continued to demand guests to stay awake. The one who had suffered the most damage was sent to the only operating room in the complex, in preparation for putting his organs back in place. It turned out that he, too, was unresponsive to sedation. He tried furiously to get rid of the straps that bound him and almost tore the ones that held his wrists, despite the soldier holding him down. Nevertheless, it took only a little more anesthetic than usual to disable him. As soon as the subject's eyes closed, his heart stopped. The autopsy report stated that his blood oxygen levels were 3 times higher than normal. Those muscles that were still on his bones were severely damaged, and 9 bones had been broken, mostly by the force of the muscles, in the course of the fight. The second survivor was the one who first started screaming. His vocal cords were damaged, so he could only shake his head, refusing the anesthetic. When someone suggested operating on him without anesthesia, he nodded his head and did not respond in any way for the entire 6 hours of surgery to recover his organs and restore what was left of his skin. The surgeon repeated several times that it was medically impossible to be alive in that condition. One of the nurses stated in horror that the patient smiled when their eyes met. When the operation was over, the patient began to wheeze loudly and burst out, looking at the doctor and trying to say something. Assuming he had something extremely important to report, he was given a pen and paper. The message was simple: keep cutting. The other two subjects underwent the same organ retrieval operation, also without anesthesia. They had to be injected with a paralyzing agent because they left all the time. However, it was unexpectedly quickly withdrawn from their bodies, and they soon began trying to free themselves again. As soon as their ability to speak returned, they began to ask for the stimulant gas to return. The researchers asked them why they had damaged themselves, why they had deprived themselves of their organs, and why they needed the gas. The answer was one: we don't have to go to sleep. All three were bound even tighter and placed back in the cell while they decided what would be done with them next. The researchers, fearing the wrath of the army financiers, offered to have them euthanized, but the commander, a former KGB man, saw the potential of the three and decided to see what would happen if they got their gas back. The researchers protested strongly, but were ignored. During preparations for the next confinement in the cell, the subjects were hooked up to an electroencephalogram, and their shackles were loosened as they were supposed to be bound for a long time. To everyone's surprise, as soon as word got out that the gas would be returned, the resistance stopped. It became clear that they were struggling to stay awake. One of those who could talk was just making loud noises. The mute one was rubbing his feet on the straps to focus his attention on something. The third kept his head raised above the pillow and blinked rapidly. Since he was the first to be hooked up to an EEG, he was the one the researchers watched and found that for the most part his encephalogram was normal, but with gaps of emptiness, as if his brain was experiencing periodic death. As all the scientists watched the paper coming out of the EEG, only one of the nurses noticed that the very moment he closed his eyes and touched the pillow, his EEG switched to deep sleep, then death. At the same moment, his heart stopped. The only subject able to speak began screaming, asking for the gas to return immediately. His EEG showed the same blank spaces. The commander ordered the two test subjects and 3 researchers to be locked in the gas chamber immediately. One of the latter, upon hearing the order, drew his pistol and shot first the commander and then the mute test subject. He pointed the muzzle at the remaining one, still bound but able to speak, while the rest of the committee ran out of the room. "I'm not going in there with those creatures. Not with you," shouted the scientist. "What on earth are you? I have to find out." The test subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so quickly? We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you, that seeks to be released at any moment in all its animal depths. We are what you hide from every night. We are the ones you try to put to sleep and paralyze by hiding in shelters we cannot penetrate. The researcher, after a little hesitation, shot the remaining subject in the heart. The egg disappeared at the same time as the letter faintly wheezed. So close to freedom. Thank you so much for your attention. Subscribe to the channel. See you soon.